Welcome, everyone. We have a very, very special guest on Legends and Lectures today. One of my favorites, Danièle Cybulskie, the 5-minute medievalist. Yeah.
Hello, hello. Nice to be
I,
here.
I I have to be honest and tell you that the Medievalists was the very first podcast I ever downloaded.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah,
Thank
during COVID, I was looking for obviously I was looking for information for books and things like that.
you.
And I came across the Medievalists on YouTube. I don't remember which episode it was that was the first one that I listened to, but it was the first time I was not a podcast person. This is hilarious because you're on a podcast. And I just decided, wow, this is just really good information.
Oh,
And I went on Podbean and I downloaded it immediately and I just binged through everything. But you have it's not only the Medievalist, there's also the Byzantine one. There's a few other like sister shows that Medievalists also post. So just in case people don't know who you are, will you please introduce yourself and tell everybody what you do?
sure. I am an author and I'm a podcaster, and I have been for quite a long time. I'm a medievalist, and my specialty tends to be 14th century England and France. And yeah, I've been writing. I write for Medievalist.net. I do the podcast, but I'm totally an indie. So anything Medievalist.net is up to Peter Konieczny, who is the founder, co-founder with Sandra Alvarez, and the editor of that site. So I really want to make it clear to people, like, I do my own thing. So if you like it, great. If you don't like it, don't blame Peter. It's not yeah. I'm totally rogue agent.
Don't worry, at the end we'll kindly ask Peter what's on the website. So if you listen to Medievalist dot or the podcast on Medievalist, so you go to Medievalist on it, you know that at the end of every podcast, you go, "Hey Peter, what's on the website?" And then Peter tells you exactly what's on
Yeah.
Medievalist.net that week
Yeah.
for new news and new events and things like that.
Yeah, so when we started that, I had been writing and contributing articles to Medievalist.net for 6 years, I think. And Peter wanted to have a podcast, but he didn't want to do it himself. And I wanted to do a podcast, but I didn't think that I would have enough name recognition by myself. So I said, I will do a podcast. You can distribute it. So we did this sort of in partnership. So it is my independent podcast. He comes on and tells us what's going on medievalist.net because it's distributed there. And yeah, that's kind of where I got my sort of public start. So it works for us, and I think that medievalist.net is still like the biggest English language sort of accumulation of articles on the Middle Ages. And so it's good to have him come on every week and tell us what's going on, because he has such a wide range of things. It's like global Middle Ages, which is great, especially because, I can only do one thing at a time every week. So it's good to be like, there's more, everyone, there's more stuff.
Yeah, it really is. It's a treasure trove of stuff. It's not only the European Middle Ages. There's also Byzantine stuff. There's also special subjects on there, which is very interesting. Like you have a whole thing about early Christianity. Let's mention very briefly, because I have one of your books here. You have several books, but your latest book is Chivalry and Courtesy: Medieval Manners for a Modern World. Would you like to tell people about it who don't know about it?
Sure. So it's kind of a sequel in that I wrote a book called How to Live Like a Monk before that, which was trying to bring together medieval history and modern science, mostly that one. So bringing it together with the medieval world so that people could compare it sort of directly and understand what people were like back in the day, because I think there is still, we've really come a long way, but I think there's still an idea that people who lived in the past were different from us, like not as intelligent or not as well mannered and things like that. So this book was important to me because medieval people were very concerned with manners and they had a lot of the same type of rules about manners that we do today. So it's just kind of part of my ongoing project to make sure that people are recognizing that people in the past are so similar to how we are today. We have like a lot of the same values, even though we're culturally different. That's important to mention. But it's we are more similar than we are different. I mean, I'm sure you get this all the time on your podcast, but it's very true. So this was one of the books that I wrote to try and bring these things together. So in here, you learn how to run a household, how to run a kingdom, how to be a knight, how to woo a lady. All that stuff is in here with details from books of manners that people were writing at the time.
Nice. So can you tell people a little bit about the How to Live Like a Monk book? I love that one too.
Yeah, I have a real like love for this book. Sometimes you finish books and you don't ever want to see them again, but this book I have a real love for. So it comes from my other love of things. So a lot of people will ask, when I'm not working, when I'm not podcasting and stuff, like, am I doing reenactments? Does my house look medieval? No, like none of that. I leave work. So when I read for fun, I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of positive psychology. I read a lot about how human beings came to be how we are. So How to Live Like a Monk was bringing together of what we know about the way that monks live and what we know about the way to be well these days. So mentally well, emotionally well, physically well. So monks were living a lifestyle that had a lot of discipline, but it also had a huge focus on what they were trying to achieve. And like, this is January, a lot of people are really focused on their goals. So there's a lot that's similar to the way we understand goals, think about goals, things like wellness and health, and the way that these monks were trying to achieve it. So I bring together the best that we had at the time I was writing it, of psychology, things about meditation, how it changes you, things about how like the Mediterranean diet is great for you, and bringing this together with monks to again humanize monks, especially because when you have such a really specific group of people, not only are they medieval, right? So they're different from us, they're different and dumber, but they're also living a really specific lifestyle. It can be hard to relate. So I was trying to bring forth monks and really give them the respect that they deserved as people who were trying to achieve something. For them, it was like the kingdom of heaven was the afterlife, and how they were working to achieve it and what they were thinking, and just making it clear to people that like this is not coming from nowhere, it's not delusional, it's not because people were dumb. And so bringing together the things that worked for them and the things that worked for us was just kind of a fun exploration, and brought together the things that I really enjoy reading about and telling people about.
Also, I think, well, we talked about this a little bit when Dave Perry was here, but we talked about how obviously people's misconception of what the Middle Ages actually was, and how again people thought people were wallowing in mud and throwing shit out of windows, and it was not like that at all. Especially with monks, they did science. They sat around, they did science, and they wrote manuscripts, and they were highly skilled people. They were farmers. They took care of their community. There were so many things that they did, especially in the early Middle Ages in the monastic period, that was not only important to themselves, but important to everybody else, really important to their community and the things that they offered. And that people think, like, oh, they didn't have time. They had clocks, like that they understood things. It's kind
Yeah.
of silly, especially when you go back and you read a lot of the things that they wrote. We'll talk about Leech Book in a second also.
Yeah.
But pe people think, that uh, they weren't smart, they weren't looking at things. That people think that the whole Bible literalism that we go through today, it was prevalent back then. No, they actually understood things like parables and metaphors, and they, I think in certain ways they get things more than we do now. Especially in terms of literalism. So actually, can you talk a little bit about early medieval Christianity, how it began its spread, and what were some of the first monastic orders?
Sure. So I need to preface this as I always do by saying I'm not a monk expert per se. So I haven't spent, my entire career working on monks. I in part did this book because I was trying to learn more about monks. So I just want to say there are better monk scholars than me. So, if you want to learn more about monks, go from here. And that is really kind of how I started writing for all of the medieval stuff I do, is like I'm the gateway drug, right? So I'm the beginning, go and find other scholars after this. So Christianity really spread for the reason that it spreads today, or the reason that people hold on to it today. And that is, it's about love, it's about forgiveness, it's about the chance to gain an afterlife that is good, when the life that we are leading today, back in the day, whatever day we're living in, can be very difficult sometimes. So it was appealing in the way that it's appealing to people today. The idea of loving your neighbor and forgiveness and all of that stuff. So that was, I mean, when you have some very vengeful gods in the ancient world, this seems pretty good. So people were starting to spread this. It started out, I'm not an ancient scholar, but it started out as sort of a cult, and then it grew. And the more powerful people you have who are adopting Christianity, the more it can grow. But when it comes to monks, it started out with people who were trying to remove themselves, especially from society, so that they could live a more Christian life. And as we know, I think anybody who knows like the barest amount about monks knows that they live a strict lifestyle. So they're trying to achieve heaven by not sinning at all, which is very difficult. So you start with the Desert Fathers who would take themselves away from society and they would try to live a life that was sin free. So none of the temptations of society. And when people saw this example, they wanted to emulate it. So people would go out and sort of like join the Desert Fathers, and then communities would grow up, and the communities would be dedicated to helping people achieve salvation. That is the main thing that they're trying to do. Sometimes people call people like this, monks and anchorites and stuff, spiritual athletes. So if that is a good way of thinking of it, it is kind of like that. They're training to make themselves not sin very much. So that started to grow because people found that to be a good goal. So people would donate money or land and help support. And of course, as this got to be more politically accepted, it was easier for these communities to grow. So even in the late antique period and the early Middle Ages, it was starting to grow quite a lot. Even that is still like not as many as people will imagine. So like not every second person was a monk in the Middle Ages. It was still like a smaller part of the population, but they were really dedicated. And then I think the easiest way to sort of get into it is to look at the rule of Saint Benedict, which is early, very early Middle Ages, that Saint Benedict was writing it. And he was a very strict abbot. He was so strict that like his first community or second community tried to poison him and he had to move. And when you read the rule of
So
Saint Benedict,
Christ-like.
you understand why. Because he's like laughing is the worst, don't do that. And so I have a personal like love of Saint Benedict because I imagine he was like such a grumpy old man and he would hate me very much because I laugh all the time. So anyway, the rule of Saint Benedict became sort of the gold standard. It was easy to understand because he wrote it very carefully. Each chapter tells you what you should be doing throughout the day, what you should be eating, who you should be talking to or not talking to. And reading was a very important part of that, which might be surprising to some people. And then in the time of Charlemagne, Charlemagne was trying to bring everybody together. So we're talking like the middle of the early Middle Ages. And so he really adopted the rule of St. Benedict, sort of took it under his wing, really understood it. And so he and his son were really part of making the rule of St. Benedict sort of the standard that people followed. So that is the most common form of monasticism in the way that we conceptualize it today. People wearing their outfit all the time, like it's just the one robe. You might have a second one for laundry days, but like simple, simple, simple. From there, people would branch out and start to do it in different ways. So you have people from Cluny who are doing it with more singing. You have the Cistercian order, which is more austere. So like they had to ask the Pope if they could wear hats in Scotland when they were in mass because it was so cold. So very austere. So that. And then as you get into the 13th century, especially 1215, there's something called the Fourth Lateran Council. And during that, the Pope was like, okay, I'm going to allow for a couple of mendicant orders. So I'm mentioning this because these are the friars, and friars are different from monks. So I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but monks are people like Benedictines, Cluniacs, Cistercians, and they stay in the monastery and they help people from there. And then you have the friars who are the Franciscans and Dominicans, and they sometimes will stay enclosed, but their mandate is really to go out and preach. So I'm going to leave it there to say that like women were also involved. There were nuns in both the sort of traditional way of being where they were completely enclosed following Benedictine rule. There are also nuns that followed St. Francis and St. Benedict. I'm sorry, St. Francis, St. Dominic, and they were enclosed, but they're two different things, monks and friars, even if they have a lot of similarities to them. And so like if you're going to learn more about monks and friars, know that they're two different things and start your journey from there.
Yeah,
I don't
wow.
know if that answers your question at all,
Yeah,
but that's
absolutely.
starts.
Actually, speaking of monks, who is Monkbot?
Oh, yeah, Monkbot. So that you're taking me back quite a long time. So I was looking at Monkbot mostly for my TED Talk, which was 8 years ago now.
It's okay.
And
It's okay.
Monkbot,
COVID was 1 year. COVID was 1 year.
yeah, right. So Monkbot is an automated little robot. He's wooden. You can find him at the Smithsonian. There are some really creepy videos of him online, but he's an automated little wooden dude who you can like sort of roll around and he glides. It is very creepy to see him, but I had him in the TED Talk as an example of people having mechanical ingenuity at this time. A monk is a good person to feature, right? Because you do see monks and nuns and stuff in your life as a medieval person. So they created this automated little robot guy who looked like a monk. And this isn't the only example of people who created robots. Especially, we were talking about Japan before we started on. Japan had some amazing robots in the Middle Ages. So they aren't like electric as we have now, but they are like cogs and wheels. And Monkbot, he's cool to look at. He's a little creepy, but he's also, that creepy cute that you get with some robots.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
yeah, you could just Google him. He's at the Smithsonian, I think.
Oh, it's fantastic. So we were talking a little bit about monks and their science
Yeah.
and how they weren't as dumb as many people in the Middle Ages as many people might think. Thanks, Victorians. So for example, we have something like leech book, right? And so the cure for infected eyes that is actually quite effective comes from leech book. There is some accuracy to it. So what other medieval remedies resulted from medieval, well, I should say, what other medical remedies resulted from medieval discoveries that you've found?
So I think that medieval medicine is so interesting because people knew so much about it. And if you have to start somewhere, start with Avicenna, who was an Islamic scholar. He wrote about everything, but he wrote the Canon of Medicine, which is a compilation of everything that they knew about medicine. And sometimes people will really not understand medieval medicine and really give it a bad name because of humoral theory. So that's saying that
Hmm.
you have fluids in your body and they need to be in balance, and sometimes they're not, and then you will bleed people out and that will help. That comes from the Greeks. So if you're maligning the Middle Ages over that, you're way off base. This is Greek and Roman medicine that we're talking about. But Avicenna had a lot of really practical stuff in his canon of medicine. Sometimes he's talking about things like heat stroke, or he's talking about how to filter water. He says the best way to do it is by distilling it, which is true. It's still true today. But some of my favorite things that are true about medieval medicine are the way that people deal with wounds, because there are going to be wounds all the time. And a lot of the things that people were using back in the day were using for quite a long time. So one of the things is peat moss, especially the type that you find in the United Kingdom. You pack wounds with it because it's very absorbent. The whole idea of moss is to contain water in it. So people would pack their wounds with moss all the way up to World War One. And people have found that the bacteria that live in this peat moss are actually going to be good, the good type of bacteria. They will kill the bad bacteria and keep your wound a little bit more sterile. I'm not saying that you should do that. I mean, like, don't go out and like grab some moss and pack your wound with it. But if you are in an emergency, desperate situation, peat moss is going to work pretty well for you. Another one is honey. Honey has antiseptic properties, which is incredible. So people would put honey in their wounds to bind them together so that they're not continually opening up. But it actually kept the wound cleaner than it would if you were just using like dirty water. I should mention also that people understood that water was better than alcohol. People did drink water,
Yes,
but they didn't
yes.
know that some water was better than others. And like I said, Avicenna was saying distilled water is the best. If you can wick it through wool, that's also good. But he's like, don't just drink it from the river, especially because it might have leeches in it. You don't want to swallow any leeches. But that brings me to the fact that people also use maggots to clean out wounds, and that works very well. That's still being used for the type of tissue that dies in diabetic wounds today. And I mentioned in my TED talk, maggots and leeches are actually registered medical devices in the United States because they work very well. Leeches will take down swelling, and maggots will eat dead flesh. So all of this stuff has been proven to work very well. Again, this is not to say that you should stop going to the doctor. We've made great leaps in medicine.
Yes.
Like whenever I talk to another medievalist, the time travel question like inevitably comes up when you're talking about your subject, right? And none of us want to go back there. So like modern medicine is a good thing, but it's interesting. Things like honey, peat moss, willow bark, which is
Hmm.
acetic salicylic acid or salicylic acid,
Aspirin. Yeah.
aspirin. These all actually work. And I think that that trial and error, that science, the actual science that creates medical work that works or medical interventions that work in the Middle Ages, it's not different from what we're doing now, except for that it's systematized now in a different way.
Yeah, yarrow is also mentioned as a fever reducer, which is still used today. And I know that there's a big one in the Carmina Gadelica. Now, technically, that's not a medieval text, but some people claim that some of these remedies go back that way. And the Carmina Gadelica states that for surface not mumps, but surface tumors. They used to use hemlock. Do not put hemlock in your mouth. You will last 5 seconds if you put hem. But it actually, and nowadays the extract from hemlock is used in removing tumors. So
Mhm.
they knew some stuff now. Obviously there was trial and error, and many people didn't make it along the way.
I know. And I think that this was something that really came up during COVID, and I was really hoping that we would move forward in that conversation of people from the Middle Ages being smart in that when the Black Death hits and every second or third person is dying, you will do anything. You will do anything to make yourself survive, make your children survive. And so when COVID hit, we were seeing people who were doing anything to survive. And that mortality rate for COVID is not negligible, but it's much smaller than 50%, you know.
Yeah.
So when we look at people who are doing stuff that seems crazy, it's to save a life. It's to save the life of someone who really means something to them. And so I think that when people talk about the Middle Ages, they also talk about the fact that death was very regular and was, but that doesn't mean that sentiment didn't exist. So will people say, well, like so many children died, like people didn't care about their children, like it's total BS. People
Yeah, we
cared.
have records. There are records of people writing about the deaths of their children and how it absolutely destroyed them.
Yeah. And so I don't know where that myth came from.
I'm blaming Petrarch. I just blame him for everything.
I think it probably comes it's borrowed from racism, the way people would speak about people of different race, like the dominant white society talking about different races in ways to justify slavery. They would come up with narratives like that, and so maybe it's borrowed from that. But I don't know. I don't know. People, of course, cared about their children, and this is a myth that persists and doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
There's a lot of them that persist. It's either Gibbon or Petrarch, so we can blame them safely. They're both dead. It's fine.
Yeah.
Can you please t tell us a little bit about your favorite early medieval texts or medieval texts in general? And somebody wanted to know, were legendary figures like Wayland the Smith and Hereward the Wake real people?
Okay, so two different questions. So you're asking me about early medieval, and I don't spend a lot of time in early medieval. I do want to say that there's a lot of beautiful stuff in Old English, and it's very haunting and it's very sad. It reminds me of a lot of Celtic stuff that is still, gets sung and written today. That stuff, that kind of not despair, but really leaning into sorrow. So the Old English stuff is so beautiful and often very sad. What got me into the Middle Ages was Arthurian literature, which happens later for the most part. There's some early Arthurian literature, especially in Wales, thinking about the Mabinogion. But I liked the later stuff, and that really sort of solidified my love of the 14th century when you have some really beautiful Arthurian stuff coming out. And my favorite texts involve Sir Gawain, which people who have like seen any of my work will know. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is my favorite one because it really gets into the difficulty of trying to lead an ideal life when you're making a vow here and you're making a vow here, and they conflict sometimes. Like, how do you deal with that? And what happens when you're up against the type of situation that makes you doubt whether you are a good knight? Are you a good person? And so that it's a very complex text psychologically if people want to read it. The Middle English is a little bit dense, but it's been translated. I think the most beautiful translation is by Tolkien, so you can get that, and it's you can be a nerd about Tolkien and read this really amazing time. It's beautiful. And then my other one is also a Gawain text, and it is about it's called Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, or at least that's the title that we give it today. And this is a loathly lady tale where Arthur gets himself into trouble, and he promises this ogre that he will answer the question, "What do women really want?" And he has a year to do this, and if he can't do this, then like he's the prisoner of this ogre guy.
If the answer wasn't cheese, he failed.
Well, you might like the answer. Spoiler alert. What happens is Arthur is like, I don't know what to do. And he wanders around, and for this entire year, he can't figure it out. He comes across this really horrible looking woman. I think one of the Middle English words is like she's besnotted, so like she's gross. Yeah. And she finds him in the woods and is like, "That's my brother. I will tell you what women really want, but in exchange, I'm gonna marry Sir Gawain." And Gawain's like, "Sure. I mean, he's an honorable knight. He's gonna do anything to save his king," and he does. And so Dame Ragnell tells Arthur what women really want is their own say. They want to be able to make a decision for themselves. And so he tells the ogre, and the ogre's like, "Oh no, I can see that way." So Ragnell marries Gawain, and on the night of their wedding, she tells him, "I'm under a spell. I'm actually really beautiful." Of course she is.
Of course.
I'm really beautiful. And you get to decide whether I'm going to be ugly during the day when everyone's going to see me, or ugly during the night when we're going to get it on.
Oh, it's
And
at night's better.
he's like, "Gosh, I don't know. It's up to you. You should decide." And that breaks the spell because
Oh,
what women really want is their own sovereignty. And so it's a beautiful story. It's one that maybe you wouldn't expect from the Middle Ages. And it does, like, it's not fully, not misogynistic. It is. But it's just a really fun story. And it gets at like a whole bunch of complicated things that we don't need to get into that people are thinking about, like what do women really want, and what do they deserve to have, and what does a good knight do? Does he marry the ugly lady, and like does it work out for him? Like all of these things are not only fun but interesting. And what I love about Arthurian literature is it's supposed to be both of those things. So it's supposed to be really entertaining, but it's also supposed to make you think in the way that the best literature, the best movies do. So I love Arthurian literature. That is my home place when it comes to how I got into the Middle Ages.
well, I've heard you many times on Medievalist say that you're Team Sir Gawain, hashtag Team Sir Gawain. So do you think that the Sir Gawain stories were based on older stories? There are many elements in some of the tales that seem to borrow on older Irish stories from the Ulster cycle.
Yeah, this one, I think that some of the earliest Arthurian stories, like I said, they were in Welsh, and they do feature Sir Gawain. So Sir Gawain is much older than Sir Lancelot. So
Hashtag Team Sir Gawain.
yeah, I mean, in the first time Lancelot appears, it's in a story by Chrétien de Troyes. This is a bit
Right.
of an aside in the 13th century, and Lancelot just appears. And I don't know if Chrétien really actually likes Lancelot. He seems like a bit of a jerk, but he like rides his horses to death. And I remember being in university and my TA being like, "I hate Lancelot. All he does is abuse his horses." But anyway, Sir Gawain's much older, and he's Arthur's nephew. And so he comes to the story. I don't think that we could say, even if we are going to go out on a limb and say Arthur was a real person, I don't think we could say that about Gawain. But he starts to appear as the sort of ideal support to a king. And I don't think that we can trace it back to Ireland. I think the earliest we can trace it back to is Wales, but he's there throughout the Arthurian stories. He doesn't appear in like the historical, I'm using quotation marks because people have question marks about Geoffrey of Monmouth's first introduction of Arthur and the way that people understood him later.
Oh yeah, the question marks as in Merlin was a real person and used magic to make Stonehenge with a giant. Yeah, I think that really happened.
There are so many question marks about King Arthur, but I don't want to alienate your audience when we're trying to bring them into the fold here. But yeah, Gawain, you can trace back to Wales, and he's one of the oldest parts of the Arthurian literature. And yeah, you could go on about him forever.
Yeah,
But you
but
were,
I think that's important though, that because people don't realize, Arthur and the legend of Arthur is cobbled together from so many things, even in the earliest days. Even Geoffrey of Monmouth was taking, Merlin from this century, and then he was taking legends of possibly Arthur, who was maybe a folk hero from this century, and smashing them all together, and then created this sort of the beginning of a mythos from characters or people maybe who had already existed. And so
yeah,
it's the same thing with with Sir Gawain, and then he gets taken here and put in here, and then Lancelot gets added, and then Percival gets added, and it just keeps going and going, and then you have the Round Table from Wace, and you have all of these other ideas that people don't realize it's all fan fiction, and in those days, in the days of the romances when court romances are really popular, what else did they do? Like they need there's no TV, there's no Game of Thrones. This was their entertainment. So of course they're going to take a character that they like and expand on it, and then somebody's going to go, "Oh, well, what about that character?" And then expand on it and then expand on it for the entertainment, for the enjoyment until you have so much. I'm sure people there was I know there was one report from in Eastern Europe where they were like, "Ooh, these tales are very racy. I like these." And then you had other people who were saying, "No, these are too sexy. We can't read these." So
yeah,
everybody had their own favorites and their own ideas, but this was their Game of Thrones. This was their medieval entertainment that they
yeah,
that they really liked.
yeah, for sure. And so it sounds like you listen to my podcast on the regular. Thank you for that. One of the episodes I did, and one of the books that I recommended from last year was the Broadview Anthology of Arthurian Literature, and they have brought together texts that you don't usually see in a syllabus on Arthur, including one that's a Jewish text. So it's written, I think it's written in Hebrew, and they're talking about the Holy Grail, but like, how do you square that with Judaism? They find a way because the stories are so entertaining, and they want to make it part of their own, entertainment for their community. So they make it work, and that book has a whole bunch of compilations of, or it has compiled together a whole bunch of primary sources that talk about Arthur from places that you might not imagine them doing. Yeah, so you have in Old Norse the prophecies of Merlin. Like, what did the Norse care about Merlin? It's a great story. So, they've written it in their own community, in their own language. And so, yeah, I love those stories. It's very similar, and I make this comparison fairly often. It's like people want to retell stories about Spider-Man. Like, there's a whole
Yeah.
Spider-Verse because people want to take this and interpret it the way they want to. And that's totally fine. It is fan fiction, but it's a long tradition, and there's nothing wrong with that. There certainly wasn't copyright back in the day, so people just took these and ran with them, and the things that they came out with were just so cool and beautiful.
And it's very important that they are stories. I know people look for a truth, especially in something, let's say like Herod the Wake, where they're like, "Oh yeah, he was totally a person." Yeah, sure, he was a real person. Do we think he had, superhuman strength and that he managed a whole battle by himself and all that? No, probably not. But the whole point was to tell a story and embellish the original material to get people interested. I think, and medieval people, I think, as I say, understood that this is not word for word. They knew that this isn't real, but
Yeah,
it was a way to relate to story and make it entertaining in a way that a wide audience could pay attention, especially since, the literacy rate was not what it is now.
yeah.
You needed to convey information in a way that people would remember it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that maybe if we are feeling judgmental, we should remember how many movies are like based on true events, based on a true story. And people will believe this is the real story, or they won't, depending on the person, but it's based on true events or whatever, and then they just run with it. So, we're still doing the same thing in our storytelling because we're like, this is a great story. It could be a better story. Let's just amp it up a little bit, and this is what they did. And so as long as we remember, even when we're looking at historical sources, we need to like take a step back and be like, what was the point of this particular text? Were they trying to tell a story, or were they trying to tell a real event? And then even then they allowed for a lot more embellishment because of what they were trying to achieve with that text. Like, are they trying to inspire people? Well, then they might embellish it here and there. And they didn't have a problem with that. And, our problem with that is our own. When you're
Yes.
accessing a text from the past, you have to do it with the eyes of the past as well as with your own to get a better understanding of it.
This is sort of like, because our next question is all about the the painting inside medieval churches. And again, today, we don't think that medieval buildings inside might have been garishly painted, but we know now that they were. What colors were medieval churches back in the day? And were there any other big medieval monuments that were painted with horrific colors?
What colors were they not? I mean, they were all colors. They were all the colors. The most expensive color was blue, especially that ultramarine color. It's hard to get because of the pigments involved, especially, lapis and things like that. Sometimes easy to get and sometimes not. And that dark crimson-y color was hard to get in fabric. And so, depending on your budget, what plants you had around, that would really have an impact on what you were doing. Who is paying for this? Like, who is paying for this pigment? Can we get it from the Middle East or further? So it was painted every different color. I mean, the relics are so blingy when you look at the metalwork that's done and like all the precious stones. I think that gives you a sense of what the inside of a church would look like. Just super bright, full of color. And when you think about that, I think it's important to recognize that the outside would also be painted, so it's colorful on the outside as well. And that when people were walking in, it would have been the most spectacular building that they saw on the regular, but also their own houses would also be painted as much as they could, right? So when we think about what people are wearing, adorning themselves with, or making their house look nice with, it's going to be the best stuff they can afford, the nicest stuff they can afford. And so it was a much more colorful world than people imagine. So when I think about like particularly garish stuff, I think about the reliquaries more than the churches. Those are intense. They're amazing. Yeah.
I like one of the things that we do here is a lot of myth busting, and so a lot of people do ask questions about things that they learn in school, and
Yeah.
one of those is the painted churches, painted statues,
Yeah.
and another one of the big ones, especially nowadays, is feudalism, and a lot of people questioning, did feudalism actually exist?
That is a tough question. And before we start on that, I just want to say I don't ever feel bad about teachers teaching what they know because teachers have a really hard gig. And especially with the Middle Ages, it's so hard to find good information. And that's why I created the 5 Minute Medievalist writing that I was doing that started as a blog. The podcast that I'm doing, it's why you're doing it because it's very hard to find good information. And this is also why I'm like, go look somewhere else. Like, start with me. I'm a generalist. Sometimes I don't always get it right. So go from here, and hopefully I'll point you in the right direction. So teachers love teachers. They can only teach what they know. Feudalism, right? So it's hard. Feudalism is one of those things where like it's nice to have a word, but it's also a curse to have a word because
Mhm.
when you call something feudalism, it has to be very specific. And does that apply to everything? So the podcast that I have this week is with Florin Curta, who's talking about Eastern Europe, in which he makes the case for like feudalism not really existing until much later. And can we call it that? And there's a whole discussion about it. So I often will use feudalism sort of in quotation marks fairly often because people have a sense of what it means. And what it tends to mean is that there are people who are tied to the land through service, tied to people above them through service. And this is all sort of based on property, like who owns the property, and in exchange, what do you do to have custodial rights over that property? So, like feudalism, should we just throw it out? I don't know. When we talk about when we talk about Western Europe, what we're looking at is people who are peasants. Some of them are serfs and some of them are free. And serfs are people who are tied to the land in that they can't do certain things without permission from their lord. So they might have to pay a fee to get married. They may have to pay a fee for inheritance. They may have to pay a fee to be an apprentice. These are all things that happen. And so lords might be private, like just dudes. Sometimes they're ladies who have inherited. They're also monasteries. So again, like I think this is where people get very cynical about the church and stuff. It's a property owning, but monasteries did own serfs as well. So it's interesting in England, if you were a serf and you married someone free, your children were free. So over the course of the Middle Ages, serfdom was already declining. So it's something that wasn't really sustainable under the law in England, as one example. But even lords had the property that they had in exchange for service to the king. So even they didn't like own it forever, the king could get them to do things for him, like participate in military service and things like that in exchange for the land. So there is a sort of pyramid, but it doesn't it doesn't allow for a lot of nuance. So feudalism is one of those words that in some ways is really great for shorthand because it gives you an idea of how like society was stacked, but it doesn't get at all the nuance. Things like slavery, which was in existence in the Middle Ages in lots of places where people don't want it to have existed, it did exist. And like, where does that fit in feudalism? Is a serf the same? They're not. But like, where do we fit this in the feudal pyramid? So it's one of those words where it's like, great that we have this word. Also, the more we try and define this word, the more actual society is slippery and slips out of that. But I think anybody looking at society, modern or in the past, knows that people don't tend to fit in boxes very well in general. So feudalism, did it exist? Sort of, but what do we mean by that? So
Yeah.
like that's the historian's answer, right? It's always it depends. It depends. So serfdom definitely a thing, slavery also a thing, property ownership in exchange for things. These all existed, but we really have to talk about time and place when we're talking about feudalism and really define our terms. And that's usually where people get lost in the weeds.
Yeah, it's just like you said, I remember seeing the pyramid scheme where, they're like, okay, serfs are here, vassals are here, knights are here, and then the
Yeah.
king is here, but they make it like it's some kind of upward mobility
Yeah.
scheme where you could somehow some way be a king if you just worked really hard. Like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it was like that. I mean, there were
No.
also yeah, no, and there were also knights who started out poor, and
Yeah.
if they got sponsored or something like that, then yeah, sure, they could become a really well-known knight. I mean, obviously that wasn't everybody, but the idea that it was here's the caste system. No one can go here except if you worked really hard, you could somehow jump all the way up to being a king. You just go,
Yeah.
that's not really how it is. And the kings weren't really, aware of serf like the individual serf on
No.
everybody's land. So,
No, no, I mean they weren't like county. They wouldn't have known, Jimmy over there with the rake in his hand, not really. Although I think that when we look at things like geography and populations, sometimes a king is a king over a very small region. Like I'm thinking about Iberia. I did a podcast on that not too long ago. We talked about the king's kingdom only being like 2,000 people, in which case you might know this. But time and place, right? Time and place. It's different all the time.
Speaking of other myths, so we talk about obviously the helpful worlds like feudalism, but
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
in England, you'll always hear people band about the heptarchy, but was it really a heptarchy?
The heptarchy. Okay, I'm not familiar with this one.
So
What do you
the
mean?
so the heptarchy is the seven kingdoms that for like Anglo-Saxon, the Essex, Wessex, and East
Right.
Anglia, etc. And then, but they go, yes, the heptarchy, like it was that's all that there was in the whole UK at the time. You're like, wait a minute, where's Wales?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, anytime it's the case for any subject, you need to know what your lenses are. Like, what are you looking through? And what is important to you? And like, how often are you thinking about the Roman Empire? Because that is going to color how you think about everything else, right? Like, if you are a person with a very like Anglo-centric, England-centric view of the world, you're gonna forget about Wales. You're gonna forget about Scotland. I mean, like some of the kings had that sort of view. Like Edward the First is like, well, we should all be one under me, So it depends on your lens, and so like I guess I'm not familiar with that because my lens doesn't tend to be the early Middle Ages, and certainly I don't really see England as being any more important than anywhere else, even though that is where I've spent a lot of my research time.
Yeah, well, a lot of people spend it between, like you say, England and France, right? But
Yeah.
so that's especially with the High Middle Ages. That's what a lot of people think about is every all the nonsense that goes on between England and France
Yeah.
and
I mean,
all their wars.
yeah, that's where I like to spend my time because I feel like it's a fascinating moment. The 14th century is my favorite. But at the same time, there's so much stuff going on, and I love learning more about what's going on outside. Even if I want to spend my time, like my time, study time on England and France, like I have a podcast episode coming out next week or the week after on the Queens of Korea. Like that's so fascinating
That's
because it's
awesome.
happening, around the same time, and like what's happening over there. So I'm always really interested in that. But we have to just recognize where we're coming from because it's not always easy to do that. It's not always easy to remind yourself, I'm coming from my background, which is this, and the stuff I've read, which is this. You really have to take that time and recognize what lens have I put on today.
We talk about when we had Professor Ronald Hutton here, we talked a lot about Celticism
Yeah,
and that specific lens of what does being a Celt mean? What are we talking about? Are we talking about Brythonic Celts? Are we talking about Gaels?
yeah.
That entire broad idea of being a Celt technically doesn't really exist because what period do we talk about? We talk about the Latinate period, what's happening, and as well when now when the Celtic or the Gaelic revival happened, the first and second time, people automatically lump together Celtic as this one broad stroke. It's the same thing when you hear the word Viking. You just go, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about the people who raided. Are we talking about the people who stayed? There are many different things we could be talking about. And again, people like to use these words to box in a specific thing, but that doesn't always fit everything because that assumes that there's one unified concept way back in history, and then people just branched out from it, which is it's kind of impossible.
It kind of, I think, tells you where people got tired. Where they got tired in their research. Like, okay, I know that there are Celts. This is really interesting. And then they didn't read the next book because it looked like it was going to be too in depth. I'm seeing this with love because like there are always borders to where you are going to stop. But I think that is revealing. Like I stopped here because I got tired of going into the weeds, and that's fine. Like not everyone's going to be a historian. As long as you recognize there's always going to be more nuance, right? Like it's not human stories are never going to be simple.
Yeah,
And
we talk a lot about the Druids also, and in fact, the only thing we know about the Druids really is that they were real people. That's about it. And people forget that, people like Pliny the Elder were writing about them. They didn't by the Middle Ages, there were no Druids. But yet, because of Geoffrey of Monmouth, thanks Jeff, jerk,
yeah,
everybody thinks that Merlin is a Druid. You're just going, dude, really? Did you not
yeah,
know anything about it?
yeah.
But that's the idea that people have, with Merlin and his woad, with his staff making the stones fly. You just go, oh, God, he really screwed us. He really did.
Yeah, and then I mean that's where you have to meet people too, right? Like if everybody thinks Merlin's a druid, that's where you have to start because that is the common idea of it. And like if you're going to undo myths, that's where you have to start is from there. And so again, like I'm never going to like just make fun of people. Well, sometimes I will gently make fun of people, but like we all had to start somewhere. And somebody told us Merlin was a druid. Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was somewhere else, maybe it was Geoffrey of Monmouth. But from there, that's where we start and that's where we learn. But yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot of myths like that are like stuck and they seem rock solid, and you have to kind of start from there. I think now there are ideas about like Robin Hood, for example, that are solidified by a Ridley Scott film, or ideas about Magna Carta that are from there. And so like you need to that's where we start. And then we expand from there and start to pull out the nuance from there. But I mean like I
Hashtag Magna Carta didn't do shit.
it wasn't what people think it is. And it certainly wasn't written by Robin Hood's dad. I think it was Robin Hood's dad that like in the movie, I think Robin Hood's dad like wrote it and hid it under a stone cross or something. I don't know, but it wasn't Robin Hood's dad that wrote Magna
That's a
Carta.
that's amazing. We'll get into the Magna Carta in just it's a second. So because somebody asked a question, I do not know the answer to this, and I was hoping that you did.
Uh-oh.
How did medieval people celebrate their birthdays? Was it just name days, or is there actual record of people celebrating their birthdays?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I haven't seen examples of peasants celebrating their birthdays, but I also haven't seen examples of kings celebrating their birthdays. I think they weren't a big deal. So, I mean, you might note it, especially if it's king, because you're like, oh, the king is now a little bit older now, but I don't think it was really a big deal. I think it was more like, which is your favorite saint? Celebrate their feast more than you might otherwise. And maybe your favorite saint is one that you are named for or had the same name as you or was on the day that you were born. But like, I don't think that birthdays were a big thing. And I don't know when they became a big thing. But I was thinking about the question, like, how would you celebrate it? And that really sort of brought me back to thinking about when we're talking about material objects, we often see in museums like the most fabulous material objects, they were really expensive and things like that. But when we're talking about person to person, like say two peasants and they want to celebrate something, they might like think back to when you were a kid or when you had no money, like me as a student, especially in many years of my life, where you'd make something for somebody and you'd make it as beautiful as you could. So carving something for someone, or baking something for someone, or just doing something that's very thoughtful doesn't involve a lot of money. So when we think about peasants, like they're not like wallowing in mud and collecting mud. And even if they were, they'd be giving the best mud to their friends. So
Best mud pie you ever had. Put a rush light on it. Yay.
so if you were to celebrate a birthday in a way that was sort of similar to the way that we do it now, maybe you would be making something for your friend, like making their favorite food, or carving something, or just creating something with your hands, maybe something for your hair. People loved adornment, and even though those things don't tend to exist for us now, it's because they're made out of things like wood, or
Yeah.
but if we were to time travel, I think you'd see a lot of adornments on people's bodies that were made of stuff that just doesn't exist now. And so when we think about birthdays and gifts and stuff, I think it would be that sort of thing. But I don't have any evidence for that, and maybe somebody else does. But I personally haven't seen birthdays being a real thing, even for kings. So I don't know. I don't know. There's always more questions than answers. And I know, like, sometimes I have talked to people on podcasts and stuff that are not specialists. And it's sort of disappointing where I'm like, yeah, everyone's just a regular person. And sometimes it's disappointing because we want them to be mythical or different. And really, it's just like Joe who occasionally has allergies going outside, like it's just they're just people. And for me that makes them more fascinating, but I recognize that for some people it ruins it a little bit, takes
Oh,
the shot.
I completely agree. We did a whole thing on St. Patrick's Day, and
Yeah,
we talked about the actual St. Patrick because we have two of his writings in his own hand. We talked about his Confessio, and the fact that he himself starts it off by saying, "I'm a sinner. I did a bad thing," possibly with his friend of 30 years, which I think is very exciting. And in the language that he uses is biblical language that hints that he might have done something sexual. And I'm like, "Ooh, spicy, Patrick, yeah." And then that's it. And obviously there's no mention of snakes and there's no mention of any of the stuff that came out of his cult from Armand down Patrick long after he died. I'm like, no, the person, Patrick the person, is so much more interest. There's so much more intrigue here because you can
yeah,
make up whatever you want about about his legend later on. Most of the stuff that he's associated with came about 300 years after he died. But his actual writings are so much more interesting because you go, are you being denied a bishopric? What did you do? It's so saucy. And people get really upset that he's not this great mythical figure who had crazy magic battles with druids who probably didn't exist in Patrick's time. And so but I agree with you in that I think the actual person is so much more humanist. It's so much more interesting because we go, wait a minute, where did all of these stories come from? when we have something here that is so much more interesting and less distract, I think that I agree with you. I think that's much more interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important. I don't think that, history repeats in exact ways or anything like that, but like how many um decisions were made because somebody was having a bad day? Like were they hungry? Did they stub their toe? Like were they thinking about somebody who didn't reciprocate their feelings? Like these are all things that we recognize as having a massive impact on our lives, but we don't recognize them as having a massive impact on other people's lives. And like, I'm not trying to be flip here and say like somebody needed a like Snickers and that's why they went to war, but just recognizing that our physiology has a lot to do with the way we interact with people, our relationships. I mean, Helen J. Nicholson is just an amazing crusade scholar, and her book on women in the crusades talks about the relationships. Like this was the sister-in-law of this person who knows this person. Like the relationships that we have just have a huge impact on how we do things. And one of the things I say to people, and maybe this sounds dumb or patronizing or something, but like the number of thoughts that we have in 60 seconds, that's the number of thoughts that they had in 60 seconds. So when we think about history, it's not these big like giant watershed moments. Like it's also somebody's like just looking at a cloud and being like, that looks like a cart to me. Like this is history as well. And so I find that really interesting. Like, what did this particular person think about? And like when we think about big disasters like the Black Death, like that is a lot of 60 seconds of thoughts of people like hearing about rumors, like, is this coming for me? What am I gonna do? Like that's a lot of thoughts that are happening. And to me, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, so I know a professor, Dr. Irving Finkel, he collects diaries for this very reason, is that, people, when they leave behind diaries, they chuck them away. But that's what he loves very much, because even though everybody knows him as a great Assyriologist, his favorite thing is collecting historical diaries and just reading everybody's every day. I mean, I think that's why, I mean, obviously Samuel Pepys is not medieval, but I think that's why people love reading his diaries because, on some days it's just like, went hunting, next. But then on other days, oh, Margaret came in and we had a lovely time, and oh, so and so died. And you think, well, who is Margaret? It's the tea. It's the tea of history
Yeah.
that you really want, and you go, ooh, scandal. And you go, well,
Yeah.
why wasn't this a big deal? His friend Margaret died. Who was that? Why was she important? Oh, he spent Valentine's Day and spent $800 on a necklace for her that he ended up giving her a month later. Because I'm just paraphrasing, but yeah, he does talk about that a lot, where he talks
Yeah.
about how expensive Valentine's Day was. But you just think, what, like, that's amazing. That's amazing. Why
Yeah.
don't we know about that? And everybody instead talks about other things from his diary. But I agree with you, and I find that the little bits
Yeah.
are the great tea of history.
Yeah, where someone's like, "Oh, my socks are so scratchy." It's relatable.
Yes.
Mine are too. Like, and that collapsing of the distance means so much to me. And that is where I come from when I'm writing stuff. I remember writing Life in Medieval Europe, and I was talking about that myth about people loving their children. And every time I went to this one paragraph, like I had to stop because I would start to cry because it was about people, how if you had a baby and they died and they were not baptized, they were not allowed to be buried in the churchyard. And there was one church in England that petitioned the Pope. They were like, can we put a fence around our graveyard? Because parents were sneaking to the churchyard at night to bury their infants
Oh,
so that they would have a chance to go to heaven because they had, like, the baby had died. They couldn't baptize it at that point. So they were like, this is the best chance for this baby to get to heaven. And that would like have to stop every time I was trying to write this paragraph because that's so real and it's so raw. And like these are people. There are people with scratchy socks, and there are people who want their children to have the best chance. And that is what makes history interesting. Yeah, we are vibing on this.
we only have a few questions left. So somebody wanted to ask you why everybody hated the Lollards. Why are they represented as foxes and marginalia all the time?
um, so the Lollards are, for people who don't know, They are people who are like sort of proto-Protestants, and like this is very loose definition, but it gives you an idea of people who are sort of like breaking away from Catholicism. They have a lot of questions. So this really comes up in the 14th century, especially after the Black Death, when the church didn't have a good reason for it existing. So like half the population has died. The Black Death keeps coming back, and the church does not, for one, doesn't have a good reason, like it doesn't have a good explanation. For another, a lot of priests died. And so the priests that were coming up, they weren't trained as well because there's no one to train them, or they had to be sort of becoming priests faster. And so the priests that that were coming up after the Black Death, people that were like subpar priests, and they didn't have the answers. And so at this time, so Catholicism being the only religion, well, that's how do I price this better? The only version of Christianity that was acceptable in the Latin West. So, of course, Islam and Judaism existed, Orthodox Christianity existed. But when it comes to like, what are people sort of in the Western part of Europe practicing? It is what we would call Catholicism now. So that's that's what I'm trying to say. Edit this if you want or not, but this is what I'm. So Protestantism is not existing. And so under these rules, only the priests really were allowed to read the Bible to you and interpret it for you. So the Lollards were saying, why can't I read it? And why can't I read it in my own language? Why can't I read it in English or French or German or whatever? And so they were really pushing towards reform in the church. So why do people hate them? Well, it was cool to hate them. And it was safer to hate them. So, and then the other thing too is like who's illustrating these manuscripts? It's going to be priests who are following the Catholic tradition, right? Well, monks usually, or people who are privately commissioned to illustrate things. Eric Fackel is a book historian, and he mentions that like in the early Middle Ages, it's mostly monks reading books. Later on, it's mostly professional scribes and illustrators making books. But the short answer is that like it's a lot safer to make fun of Lollards than to be one of them. And the Lollards didn't have the answers to all the questions either. So it's a lot safer to follow like a centuries old tradition of the way we have always, followed religion. That's safer. And we like this better, and it's more familiar and it's more comfortable. The idea of Protestantism took a very long time to develop and catch on. So we could call the Lollards sort of the beginning of that, or one of the beginnings of that. Um, Again, history's complicated, right? People had always criticized the church. People were not like a monolith who were like, we are all on board with the way that religion is being practiced. So there's always questions of the church, and a lot of people not going to church or not practicing or criticizing the priests. So this is continuous, but that doesn't mean that they're ready to jump ship. That's a big step, especially when your immortal soul is involved, right? It's a big step to say, I'm not going to do what the priests say, and perhaps put your immortal soul in jeopardy, especially at a time when, the Black Death is coming back around again. So, um, it was not cool to be a Lollard. Even if some of the trendier people were becoming Lollards, like John of Gaunt is like more of a fan of them than other people. But it's definitely safer socially to not be one. If you are going to be one, if you're going to read the Bible in English, like do it on the sly, don't let anyone know. So the people, it's funny because the people who are painting them as foxes, they could just as well have been reading the Bible in the English, but they don't want anyone to know about
Hmm.
it. They're going to keep painting that. So it is a safer option socially. And this doesn't mean like people are, depending on what we're looking at, not everybody's getting burned at the stake for being a Lollard, but that doesn't mean you want to be associated with them, especially in public. And it also is a little bit dangerous in terms of your immortal soul because like there's no evidence, nobody has come back and told us that the Lollards are on the right track, right? So if you are used to Catholicism and it makes sense to you and people have explained it to you, this is the way, it's very hard to change how you're practicing religion.
There's
Yeah.
also people don't realize that as well. In some places, it was completely illegal to be an atheist publicly. So if you didn't believe in any of this, atheism was if you said no, God is fake, this is not for me, you could be killed for that. So,
Well,
yeah.
Lollards were occasionally executed, not super often, but definitely publicly, especially in the time of Henry IV. The future Henry V, supervised a Lollard being burned, so it was illegal. So that's what I'm saying is like it's safer to not be one, but that doesn't mean people weren't secretly Lollards. There are quite a lot of texts that shouldn't exist, that do exist because people were secretly keeping copies of maybe the gospel written in English because it gave them some spiritual comfort, but it was not legal. It's not something that you could share or tell people that you had. So why do people hate them? Because it's safer to do that.
Or just publicly think they're not cool, and then on the side you just go, "Oh man, you're awesome. I'm your biggest fan."
Yeah, well, you're talking about atheism. Like, I believe that a lot of people had doubts because faith is, by definition, something you can't prove. So I think a lot of people had doubts, but did they say that? I don't know. There is a poet called Alcius March who is from somewhere in the Iberian Peninsula. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he writes some very agonized poetry about how, like, he knows he's supposed to believe in heaven, but he doesn't, and he doesn't know what to do about it. So there are like kind of poems that are prayers to God saying, I don't really believe in you. Can you help me? Because I know I'm supposed to. And I think there are a lot of people like that that just didn't admit it and certainly didn't write it down. Because again, like, who are the people who are literate, people who are trained in the church, which means the Catholic tradition? So, you know, you don't want to admit that stuff, and don't put it in writing. Lawyers will tell you, like, don't put it in writing. So yeah, it's again, it's complicated, and I think more mysterious than just a straightforward like we hate Lollards. But yeah, those people were taking the side that was definitely not going to get them in trouble.
There was, I know there's one third party account, at least that I found, of people saying that there was a guy outside of a pub who was preaching, saying that God isn't real, don't believe it. And I mean, they wrote him off as a drunk, and therefore, I guess he lived. I guess he was fine and didn't get taken away. But there were definitely some records of people saying, but again, it was third party. It wasn't the people themselves writing down the things that they were saying. So it is
Yeah.
true.
And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is a good time to mention that. Like, you could make mistakes and
Mhm.
you wouldn't be immediately burned. In fact, the only people who were punished that severely were people who the church thought were going to, like, ruin everyone else. So that guy would probably be in trouble, but as long as he repented and he did his penance, like, he's fine. He's fine. He's not going to be burned at the stake. But if he persisted, he showed up every day, despite the fact that he'd been arrested, he came back out and did the same thing, then he would be in danger. But most of the time, you could express some doubts, on the sly or at the pub or something. And as long as you corrected and, confessed and did your penance, like, it's fine. It's no problem. And I think that that's definitely a myth that people have. Like, you go outside and you say, like, I don't know, swear something that is terrible about Jesus. Like, you're not going to get burned, but you do need to correct yourself if you want to have a smooth ride in society.
So remember, kids, the real hashtag of the Middle Ages is check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yeah, yeah. that, that was on everyone's like t-shirt on everyone's social media back in the day. Check yourself before before you get wrecked.
Yeah, by other people.
Yeah.
Last question. What is one thing that you wish more people knew about the Middle Ages, other than that the Magna Carta didn't really do shit?
Other than that, well, one thing I wish people knew about the Magna Carta, is that it didn't apply to everybody. It only applied to people who were free, and it especially applied to people who had standing. And so
Mhm.
when we're talking about like a jury of your peers, that means you are an earl and you're judged by other earls. Like, you can't be judged by peasants. Like, jury of your peers doesn't mean everyone is equal, for example. So it has very little to do with serfs, for example. And there were more serfs at the time it was written. So, Magna Carta, it's a whole thing. What what do I wish people knew about the Middle Ages? That, well, first of all, that people are people. And so this applies to everything. So it applies to the way that they thought about each other and it applies to the way they thought about people who are different. So when we're talking about people um, who might be in a marginalized group, what we call a marginalized group today, so that people who are visually racialized, maybe they don't look like the majority group that's there, or maybe there are people who are LGBTQ. If they are hanging out in a village and everybody sees them and everybody knows them, we know from today that like there's a discussion all the time, like we should get rid of these immigrants, oh but not that one because we like this person, he's my favorite person. It's the same thing in the Middle Ages. So there are more people, first of all, there are more people who are like not straight white Christians than we think. Like it's a diverse population. And again, depending on where we are and who we're looking at and all that stuff. And within that population, there is a lot more latitude than we think. So this is not to say that there isn't persecution, that there isn't like what we would now call racism or sexism and all that stuff. It all existed, but perhaps not to the extent that we think. So you can have, for example, Arthurian stories. There are people of color in Arthurian stories, and it's fine because they're awesome knights. Like their skin color is irrelevant to their deeds. And so I think this is something that people maybe don't recognize about the Middle Ages, that it's true. And I think there are people who like are roommates in the village, and everyone's like, are the
Uh-huh.
roommates like Ernie and Bert type situation? And they're just left alone because they're good people and we like them. And so there's no trouble. So when people get in trouble with the law, especially for things that they might have thought of as, again, I'm using a lot of air quotes, thought of as deviant, like for example, um, uh, homosexuality or something, that was illegal in the Middle Ages. But it really, like whether you got in trouble for it or not, depended on your relationship with your neighbors. It depended on the personality of your neighbors. You could, there, people who are LGBTQ have always existed, and they're not like getting persecuted left and right. And that is because, first of all, they're closeted in a lot of cases. And secondly, people know about it, but they don't care because it may not be relevant to their relationship. Like this person, this roommate is perfectly nice. Like, why should I persecute them? And so, again, like this is not to minimize the real harm that comes to marginalized communities in the Middle Ages, but it is a lot more diverse than people think. And there are a lot more exceptions made than people think. And this is based on the relationships that people have. So there's fewer executions than people think. And that's because the jury knows that person. And so they would much rather find them than execute them. And so this is all, we can't always, again, talking about our lens, is like read back from the modern world and be like, everybody is the same as us. But we are more similar than different in ways where we accept people or we don't accept people, and that's not always based on the hard lines of religion or skin color or whatever rules, but based on the relationships that we have with each other. So when we look back at history, I think that we always need to sort of automatically train ourselves to think about, okay, what is this person like on the ground? What, like we think of fictional characters, like what's their favorite color and like how did they grow up and who is this person to them? Like even if their social lives are different, like they're a different social class, they might still get along because they both like chess or something. So that sort of nuance is really important when you're starting to look at and read the Middle Ages, to understand that these are complex people who have a lot of thoughts within 60 seconds, who have a lot of feelings, and that feelings really drive human behavior. So it's not rules that drive human behavior, it's feelings. And so when we apply this to the past, it makes it much more colorful and beautiful and interesting. And that is what makes history great, I think. That's my soapbox, right? You gave me the soapbox and I stepped right on
And
it,
I'm
but
glad you stepped on it because that's exactly what we like. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for being here. This is really such a treat for me. And now that we're at the end, why don't we ask you what's on the website?
oh, I don't know because I don't run the website.
Peter, we need Peter here. That's what we need.
Yeah, because that's all Peter. Like that's not me at all. I only do my podcast, but I will say that the podcast coming out this week, or that has just dropped this week, is about Eastern Europe, which is exciting for me because I didn't know a lot about it, and Florian is amazing. And next week unless something changes, should be Alan Schmid, who's talking about Korean women. That's awesome. That's
Amazing.
awesome. And I have more stuff lined up that hopefully, if it works out, will be talking about people of different religions in different spots, like Jerusalem. I always love talking about women's history, so you'll find all that stuff on my podcast, and then on Peter's website, which has nothing to do with me. There's stuff on everything. Everything's there.
So when's the next book coming out? When are we seeing a book on Arthurian women? I want to
Um,
see you do a dissertation on Silence. I don't know much about her. I'd love to hear more about her.
well, I'm not gonna write that book yet.
No.
If you now put it in my brain, maybe I will at some point. I am
Haha.
working on a book proposal, and just the way that my career has worked, I have never had to write a book proposal like this before, and it is exploding my brain. So I don't know when the next book will come out, but I can tell you that I'm working on it, that it will be in the same vein as the stuff that I like talking about, which is ordinary people and what's involved in their lives, what they're interested in. And then I can tell you as much as like it's going to be in my favorite period, and that is as far as I can go. But hopefully it will be out in a couple of years. It is a project I really want to do, but that really depends on how the book proposal goes and if anyone wants to pick it up. So fingers crossed.
Everybody pick it up right now. I want to read it. I'm tired of reading crap. I need more things from Danielle, please.
But the podcast will be out every week,
Every
Michelle.
week.
Every week.